Attu, Alaska, the westernmost edge of America, where the Aleutian Islands touch the icy Pacific. Most Americans don't even know this desolate place exists, a place soaked in blood during the Battle of Attu in 1943, one of the fiercest fights ever fought on American soil during World War II. Today, Attu is nothing but the ruins of abandoned military outposts, collapsing roofs buried under snow, and winds that howl like the cries of restless souls yet to find peace. Thomas Koe. Madsen was born in Nome, of Norwegian descent, and had spent his entire life in Alaska's bitter cold. At 51, he was one of the few who dared to venture into the Aleutians in winter, when blizzards smashed the coastline like relentless artillery. Thomas regularly took long fishing trips offshore to support his family. His wife had died of cancer, leaving behind a little daughter now living with her grandmother. The sea and solitude were all he had left. That day, the sky was gray, clouds pressing down on the horizon, threatening to unleash their fury at any moment. Thomas stepped off his wooden skiff, oars creaking under his calloused hands. He cursed last night's blizzard for scattering his nets along the northern shore. If he didn't retrieve them soon, they'd drift away into the deep. The shore of Attu had no clear paths, only pebbles and slush, with rotting wooden stakes left over from the U.S. Army's time here, now jutting skyward like broken fingers. Thomas dragged his heavy plastic gearbox, each step crunching into the slippery gravel, his eyes constantly watching the silver waves pounding the beach as though keeping tabs on him. Then he stopped. At the water's edge, where the waves had just receded, something caught his eye. An enormous chain. The links, blackened, each as thick as a man's wrist, rusted so badly their surfaces looked like bloodstains, half buried in the icy gravel. They stretched silently into the murky water, disappearing like the body of a giant snake slithering into the depths. Thomas squinted, his heart thudding. That chain, there was no way it belonged to any fishing equipment. It was too big, too old. He glanced around. No one in sight, just wind and surf. A chill ran down his spine as he crouched, gripped one of the links with both hands, and tried to lift it from the ground. It was brutally heavy. The cold of the metal seeped into his flesh. A strange feeling stirred inside him. That sixth sense, the instinct of a man who had lived his whole life with the sea, whispered that this chain was connected to something massive and dangerous lying below. He quickly reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his old waterproofed phone, and snapped several photos. The screen fogged with sea mist, but the pictures clearly showed those rusty links stretching into nothingness. Thomas straightened, staring at the sea, thinking. In his mind echoed the stories his father had told him as a boy, of missing ships, sailors who went down with their destroyers just off the Aleutians, and how their cries could still be heard on certain nights. He took a deep breath and dialed directly to the Coast Guard station in Dutch Harbor. A voice answered crisply on the other end. "Coast Guard, Dutch Harbor, Schaefer speaking." Thomas glanced back at the chain, swallowed hard. "This is Thomas Madsen. You might want to send someone out to Attu right away. I just found something. Something you're going to want to see for yourself." There was silence on the line for a few seconds. Then, "Copy that, Madsen. We'll dispatch a team to investigate. Leave it untouched." Thomas ended the call. The wind lashed his face, but his chest burned with an unexplainable heat. He had no idea that within just a few days, all of America would be stunned by the dark secret that had been sleeping for 82 years beneath the waters of Attu. Just 3 days after Thomas's call, an MH-60 Jayhawk Coast Guard helicopter roared through the gray sky, slicing the frigid winds as it sped toward Attu Island. The rotors churned the air, spraying white sea mist across the desolate beach where Thomas Madsen had been waiting all morning. Arms folded, knit cap pulled low, his eyes never left the dark line in the surf where that massive chain disappeared into the sea. He knew whatever lay beneath would change his life forever. The helicopter touched down on a barren stretch of gravel to the north, kicking up clouds of dust and snow. The door swung open, and out stepped Lieutenant Matthew P. Schaefer, commander of the Coast Guard's Rapid Response Unit stationed at Dutch Harbor, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes, a veteran of Iraq before transferring to Alaska. Behind him followed a four-man team: 2 divers, a Navy engineer, and an explosive ordnance safety officer. Thomas approached and shook Schaefer's hand. "Madsen?" Schaefer asked, his voice cutting through the wind. "That's me," Thomas replied with a nod. "You got here just in time. The chain, it's still exactly where it was." Schaefer turned, his eyes sweeping over the desolate shore to where the rusty chain coiled up among the foamy surf. He pulled out binoculars, scanning each massive link, his brow furrowing. "That's unlike anything I've seen before," he murmured. "We'll set up a secure perimeter and get a dive team in the water immediately." Within minutes, the team erected red-flagged barricades around the site and drove stakes into the frozen gravel. The engineer deployed radiation and magnetic field sensors next to the chain, checking readings. The divers, John H. Lombard, a retired Navy SEAL now working civilian contracts, and Nathaniel Nate Royce, a young Alaska-born diver hardened by Aleutian waters, began suiting up. Their thick rubber suits and hoods left only their eyes visible against the freezing spray. Before entering the water, Lombard paused beside Thomas, gazing out toward the horizon. "You didn't touch the chain, right?" "No," Thomas answered firmly. "I followed your instructions." Lombard nodded faintly, pulled his mask down, and together with Royce, slowly waded into the frigid water, white foam breaking around them. The safety cables tethered to them stretched and tightened with the surge of the waves. Lieutenant Schaefer stood at the edge of the barricade, radio clutched tight, his eyes fixed on the sea. The only sound beyond the crashing surf was the crackle of the headset, the divers' heavy breathing, the hiss of their regulators, and Nate's voice coming through with curiosity, chains embedded deep, massive, still intact. "Stay on it," Schaefer's voice cut back through the radio. "Report anything unusual." Thomas stood nearby, his palms cold, his gaze locked on the cables bobbing with each swell. Something deep inside him felt uneasy. The wind shifted suddenly, blasting in from offshore, carrying a sharp metallic tang of rust and salt that made him shiver. A crisp click came through the radio. Then Nate's voice. "We're down to about 25 feet. Chain extends northeast. Nothing but gravel and silt so far." 1 minute. Then 10. The tension on shore grew heavy. Schaefer gritted his teeth and pressed the transmit button. "Keep going. Watch carefully around the chain. Report any debris or structure immediately." Another hiss of breath. Then Lombard's voice, low and heavy. "Down to about 50 feet. Visibility poor, but I see something. Looks like steel framework, moving closer." Everyone on shore froze, the radio falling silent but for static. Thomas clenched his fists, feeling his heart hammer in his chest. He'd lived his whole life by the sea, and it had never felt this quiet. Lombard's voice returned, slower, weighted. "God, I think we're looking at a hull. Big one, still mostly intact." There was a faint metallic thud through the speaker, perhaps him making contact. Then a trembling voice from Nate. "Oh God, it's a warship, and it looks like there's still a lot inside." On shore, Schaefer blinked, his knuckles whitening around the radio. He turned sharply to the engineer. "Call HQ now. Get the EOD team en route. This is not something we want to poke at, unprepared." Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes still fixed on the endless chain disappearing into the depths, like a scar running down into the ocean's heart. He felt the cold reach into his very bones as he realized that what he had dragged the Coast Guard here to see might well be the ghost of a buried sin, sleeping for nearly a century at the bottom of Attu's waters. That night, the blizzard hit Attu earlier than expected. Wind screamed across the ice-covered hills, whipping sheets of white snow and slamming into the beach where Lieutenant Schaefer's team remained on watch. The yellow halogen floodlights of their makeshift field post flickered against the gusts. Below the waves, in the frigid darkness, the two divers continued following the massive chain into deeper water, descending into blackness. Over the radio, Nate's labored breathing mixed with Lombard's steady, low voice and dry instructions. On shore, Schaefer pressed his ear to the receiver, his expression tight. "Keep going, slow and steady." "How much farther?" Lombard's voice came back, faintly trembling. "Depth, about 75 feet now. Light's dimming, but I see it more clearly now. Hull, very large, lying on the seafloor." A heavy silence settled over the beach. Thomas Madsen stood nearby, his breath turning to white mist. He stared out to sea, a growing, unnamed dread gnawing at him.
"Isn't dress-up day Friday?" another voice chuckled. Emily kept walking. Shadow moved with her, matching her step for step like a shadow in uniform. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. But when a football player named Jake Kincaid, tall, broad-shouldered, with a smug grin and a Letterman jacket stretched tight over muscle, started mock-marching behind her chanting, "Left, right, left, right." Shadow suddenly stopped. Jake did too. Shadow turned his head slowly, his eyes locking on the boy with a stare so direct it silenced the hallway. For one breathless moment, the space between them was taut like a tripwire. Jake gave a short, nervous laugh and stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "All right, soldier dog, chill." Emily didn't need to speak. Shadow had already said enough. They continued walking. Emily's locker was near the end of the main corridor, inconveniently positioned across from the cafeteria entrance, the most heavily trafficked artery in the school.
"Oh God, look, inside, artillery shells, ammo crates, still sealed." Schaefer flinched, barking into the radio. "Don't touch anything. Just observe, you hear me?" "Roger, Roger," Lombard replied, his breathing heavy. Inside the wreck, their weak dive lights swept over rusted steel, warped hatches, severed cables hanging like cobwebs. Lombard swung his light left and froze. A cargo bay lay open, filled with splintered wooden crates spilling their contents, massive copper-jacketed shells as thick as a man's thigh, glinting under the beam. Nate swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "This is an armory. My God, still intact." He leaned closer, his light falling on rows of steel spheres stacked in the next bay. Beneath dust and barnacles, faded Japanese stencils could still be read. Weixian, Baofa Wu, danger, explosives. Lombard swept his light farther into another compartment, revealing dozens of spherical naval mines, their corroded hulls pocked with rust, yet their detonators still clearly in place. He whispered, "Sea mines. So many. Unfused." On shore, Schaefer signaled to the engineer and EOD specialist, his jaw tight. He knew a single wrong move down there, and both divers could be vaporized in an instant, the shockwave tearing the entire bay apart. Suddenly, Lombard's voice crackled through, barely above a whisper. "My God! Grenades! Still pinned!" His light illuminated smaller wooden boxes, their lids askew, packed with Type 97 hand grenades, their green paint chipped, but their pins gleaming. Nate gasped. "We're standing on a giant bomb. Could go off at any second." Schaefer cut in, his voice sharp and cold. "Stop! Pull out now. Keep the lines tight. Don't touch anything else. Now!" The heavy breathing, the scrape of metal on steel echoed over the radio as the two began retreating from the wreck. In the faint beam, the sea mines seemed like dead eyes in the abyss, silently watching them ascend. When Lombard and Nate finally broke the surface, the beach seemed to exhale. Schaefer and two others rushed forward, hauling them onto the gravel. Water streamed from their suits. the freezing air cutting into their skin, but their eyes were still fixed on the dark water where the chain vanished. Lombard ripped off his mask, growling, "Sir, that's a powder keg down there. A killing field. If it blows, it'll rip this whole bay apart." Schaefer clenched his fists, turning to the EOD tech. "Call Anchorage. Deploy the full ordnance disposal team. And alert the Army." This is no longer just a Coast Guard matter. Thomas Madsen stood silently in the back, feeling his blood turn to ice. Slowly he gazed out at the sea, the waves crashing now like the beat of war drums echoing from the past. He knew he had stirred something that perhaps should have stayed buried forever beneath the cold sea. News of the deadly arsenal lying deep beneath the waters off Attu spread across Alaska like a winter storm. Within just 48 hours, a U.S. Air Force C-130 Hercules transport plane touched down at Dutch Harbor, carrying an ordnance disposal team and a thin, contemplative man. Eric J. Niederost, a renowned military historian and author of several books on the Alaskan front and the bloody Battle of Attu in 1943. Eric was no stranger to Attu. He'd written an entire chapter about it in his book, Forgotten Front, calling it the loneliest battlefield on American soil. Yet, standing now on this desolate, frozen beach, seeing the rusted chain snaking into the black water, he had to look away for a moment and take a deep breath to steady himself. At the sight, Eric crouched to examine the massive links, red warning flags snapping in the frigid northern wind. Lieutenant Schaefer stepped forward to greet him, his voice grave. "Professor Niederost, we've conducted an initial dive survey. It's clearly a large warship. Ordnance still intact. We need you to help us identify exactly what it is." Eric nodded silently, then turned to Thomas Madsen and gripped his hand firmly. "You're the one who found it? Do you realize you just brought back a piece of our history long forgotten?" Thomas answered quietly, his voice low. "I just felt like it was staring at me, like it wanted to be pulled out of the dark." The next morning, under Attu's dim sunrise, Eric, Schaefer, and the technical team sat inside a makeshift command tent on the beach. On the monitor linked to the diver's camera, the wreck appeared clearer. A massive steel frame covered in barnacles, a rusted military insignia barely visible on a corroded plate, and rows upon rows of stacked munitions. Eric stared at the images, muttering almost to himself. "No doubt about it. That's a Fubuki-class destroyer, the most advanced ships the Imperial Japanese Navy had in 1943. He stood, pointing his pen at a detail on screen, a faint, corroded number and lettering etched into the ship's side. "I've seen this in archived records. A Japanese destroyer was reported lost off Attu, but no one ever found it. Records remain classified to this day. They called it Ikazuchi. Thunderbolt." The tent fell silent. Eric continued. "Ikazuchi was escorting a convoy bringing reinforcements, weapons, and chemical supply containers to the Japanese garrison on the island. But during the Battle of Attu in May 1943, it vanished from radar. The U.S. Navy never admitted sinking it, and Japan never acknowledged the loss. It became just another secret buried at the bottom of the sea. That afternoon, a frail, white-haired American veteran named Albert Al Reed, 101 years old, was flown in from Anchorage. He had fought in the Battle of Attu, one of the few still alive. As he stepped off the helicopter, he clung to Thomas's arm, his tear-filled eyes gazing out at the ocean. I know this place," he said. "That night, we heard an explosion. Huge. The cliffside shook. But come morning, no one said anything. We weren't allowed to ask. We just knew hundreds of Japanese were gone. Now I understand." He paused, his eyes fixed on the gray, silver-tipped waves. They never really left. That evening, in the command tent, Eric leafed through a stack of declassified documents he'd brought. Black and white photos of Attu's beaches after the battle, vague reports of a secret Japanese convoy, carrying unknown materials that went missing. He tapped a finger on one of the reports, his voice low and heavy. These records say the supplies Akazuchi carried weren't just shells, but experimental chemical agents. The Japanese called it blue smoke. They planned to use it to clear American trenches. But when the ship went down, nobody wanted to report it. Maybe because both sides feared what it could mean. The air in the tent grew thick. Schaefer murmured, "You think that cargo hold down there still has it?" Eric clenched his hand, his eyes narrowing at the dark waves outside. "It might. And that's what makes it more dangerous than any mine." The next morning, as the storm eased, a senior Army officer from Anchorage arrived by helicopter. He quietly surveyed the water, then ordered a security perimeter to be set, restricted all access within 500 meters, and instructed the chemical weapons response team to deploy immediately. Thomas stood on the edge of the beach, his coat flapping in the wind. He watched the military trucks rumble in, the bomb disposal teams and chemical specialists quietly assembling their gear. He felt fragments of a long-forgotten war rising from the seabed, ghosts demanding to be seen, to be remembered, and to be dealt with before another disaster struck. Across the beach, Eric stepped out of the tent to stand beside Thomas. He spoke softly, his words almost lost in the cold wind. "We didn't just find a wreck. We found a secret that men died to bury. And on that desolate beach, where the rusted chain still sank deep into the ocean, Thomas felt as though 100 invisible eyes were watching him. Eyes from the past. That had never truly slept. The blizzard raged on for 2 days, burying Atu in a thick white shroud so dense the shoreline was barely visible. Inside the command tent, flashlights and generators ran through the night, the radio crackling with short, clipped orders from Anchorage. The bomb disposal and chemical response teams had finished erecting the security perimeter, cordoning off more than half a kilometer of beach. Soldiers in full protective suits and respirators moved slowly, carrying heavy crates of equipment down to the water's edge. No one spoke loudly. Only the crunch of boots in the snow could be heard, as if everyone knew they were standing atop a massive bomb waiting to go off. Lieutenant Schaefer stood next to Thomas, his eyes fixed on the sea. He'd grown used to tense situations over the years, but few scenes had ever weighed on him like this. Beneath those waves lay tons of explosives, sea mines, and a secret no one could yet gauge the danger of if disturbed the wrong way. Thomas drew in a deep breath of icy air, hearing Eric's words from the night before echoing in his mind. The most dangerous thing down there isn't the shells or the grenades. It's what they never wanted to admit they were carrying. In the tent, Eric hunched over the map, scribbling notes on the schematic of the wreck the dive team had reconstructed. He muttered disconnected phrases under his breath. Midship, container, blue smoke, unconfirmed. A Navy engineer approached and set down a small metal sample retrieved from the hull. On its corroded surface, the black warning letters were still clear. Danger. Explosives. Eric stared at the shard of metal, his brow furrowed. He spoke quietly to Schaefer. If it's still intact, that amount of chemical agent could kill hundreds of people in minutes. And if seawater has already breached those drums, we don't know what might happen next. Outside, the wind lashed against the tarps, making them shudder and snap. A young soldier ran into the tent, his face pale. "Sir, we've detected gas leakage from the wreck. Readings are irregular." Schaefer immediately barked orders. "Clear all civilians from the area. Extend the perimeter, seal off the entire shoreline. And report this to command immediately." Thomas backed away, his hands trembling, not entirely from the cold. From where he stood, he could see the black water beyond, lightly churning, white foam bubbling as if something beneath was stirring. He no longer saw the chain as just a lifeless relic, but as a warning, dragging all the deadly memories of the past to the surface, threatening to swallow this tiny island whole. The next morning, the sky cleared after the storm, revealing a silvery gray canopy above and the ocean like a vast black mirror. Inside the command tent, the air remained heavy. The readings of toxic gas leaking from the wreck continued to climb slightly each hour, forcing the chemical response team to accelerate their efforts. Eric sat at the table, in front of him a stack of old files, copies of declassified reports he had spent years requesting. He folded his arms, his eyes dark as he opened a thin folder with a red stamped cover. Confidential, Pacific Theater, 1943. He looked at Schaefer and began to explain, his voice slow but firm. When I studied these records years ago, I noticed something odd. Some of Japan's supply convoys at the time were never officially logged. Ships simply disappeared, and neither side ever said a word. I always wondered, why? He pushed the folder forward, opening to a black and white photograph. A Japanese destroyer identical to the wreck beneath the sea, loaded with white-painted steel drums. A handwritten note below the photo read, "Blue Smoke Shipment. Do not engage." Eric locked eyes with Schaefer. Blue Smoke was the U.S. code name for an experimental Japanese chemical agent. According to these records, they planned to use it to clear American trench systems in the event of a defensive collapse. And when this ship sank, no one wanted to report it. Probably because admitting it risked both sides being accused of war crimes. Schaefer clenched his fist, muttering, "So, both sides chose to look away, to bury it at the bottom of the sea." Eric nodded slightly, then pointed toward the water. "But now it's surfacing. And if those chemical drums have already started leaking, Attu could become an environmental disaster. Not to mention if someone mishandles it." He left the thought hanging, his eyes darkening. That afternoon, an intelligence officer from Anchorage arrived by helicopter. He spoke briefly and firmly. The area was now designated as national priority and completely off limits, even to the press. All personnel were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. Thomas watched it all in silence. He stood just beyond the fence line, staring out at the calm ocean. In his mind, he kept seeing the invisible eyes he'd felt on him the night before, as if restless spirits were demanding an answer. He wondered if they would ever find peace, while the truth remained buried like this. That night, Attu was eerily quiet. The wind had died, leaving only the gentle slap of waves on the shore. In the darkness, Thomas stood there still, watching the chain sink into the deep, wondering what would happen when the secret finally came to light. On the third night after the area was sealed off, Attu sank into an eerie, unusual stillness. There was no wind, no falling snow, yet the whole island felt wrapped in a strange silence so deep that even the gentle lapping of the waves echoed like drums from the past. Outside the security fence, Thomas stood, his eyes fixed on the pitch-black horizon. A handwritten note below the photo read, "Blue Smoke Shipment. Do not engage." Eric locked eyes with Schaefer. Blue Smoke was the U.S. code name for an experimental Japanese chemical agent. Far down the shore, the ordnance team continued their work quietly. Divers went down and came up, carrying sealed containers marked with bold hazard warnings. Floodlights illuminated a wide stretch of water offshore, their pale beams shimmering against the cold, black swells. But around midnight, everything suddenly stopped. The radio crackled to life in the command tent, a diver's voice urgent. "Movement detected under the hull." Pressure spiking abnormally. "We feel vibrations. Request verification." The whole camp sprang into motion, floodlights swinging toward the water. An officer barked, "Everyone out of the water immediately! Extend the fence! Prepare for emergency protocol!" Thomas frowned, gripping the rail tightly. Out at sea, the surface began to ripple strangely, streaks of white foam spreading with a metallic, acrid smell. Soldiers nearby whispered nervously to each other, and the words "gas leak" and "destabilized hull" kept coming up. Then, a series of muffled pops echoed from below the waves. Not loud, but enough to send fountains of foam spraying into the air. The entire beach froze for a few seconds before shouts rang out. "Clear the shore! Possible collapse!" Spotlights caught figures running chaotically away from the water's edge. But Thomas stayed rooted to the spot, his eyes wide as he caught a glimpse of something beneath the frothing surface. A large piece of twisted metal slowly breaking free from the wreck and sinking. That night, longtime islanders later claimed they heard strange moaning from the shoreline, like hundreds of voices whispering all at once, then abruptly falling silent. An Alaskan journalist, Rebecca L. Palsha, who was there to cover the story, later wrote in her report, "It was a night I'll never forget. Not because of the chemical smell or the floodlights glaring into the sea, but because it felt as if Attu had woken up and the ghosts of the battle rose ashore, demanding we finally face the truth." Thomas left the beach just before dawn, his eyes still fixed on the chain, now nearly swallowed by the waves. He knew from this moment on, there was no turning back. Whatever they had disturbed was now awake, and those ghosts would not rest until everything was brought to light. The next morning arrived with a silvery sky and a deep, quiet blue sea. The terrifying night was over, but its mark remained etched on the shores of Attu. A section of the corroded hull now jutted above the waterline, the dark whirlpool around it a stark reminder that the secret below could no longer be hidden. The ordnance and chemical response teams were reinforced with personnel flown in from Anchorage and even Seattle. Sealed containers were lined up on shore, then flown out at night on transport planes for safe disposal. The acrid scent of chemicals still lingered on the waves, forcing soldiers to replace their respirators constantly. That morning, a press release was issued by the U.S. Department of Defense, brief and cold. "We have located and safely recovered part of a World War II-era warship and its hazardous materials. There is no longer any danger to the public. The site will remain under close monitoring." Not a word about blue smoke. Not a word about the ghosts of the Battle of Attu, those who had never truly been remembered properly. On the 7th day of the operation, a memorial service was held in Anchorage. The names of American and Japanese soldiers who died in the battle for Attu were read aloud, one by one. A small memorial stone was erected, its inscription reading, "To those who never came home. Attu, 1943. Eric stood quietly in the back row, his head bowed. Thomas was there too, his dark suit looking out of place among the uniforms. When the mournful bugle call rang out, Thomas couldn't help but lift his eyes to the black and white photograph of the last Japanese soldiers on Attu. He felt their eyes on him, not with hatred, but with a simple plea, to be remembered, to have the truth spoken, to have their names known. The ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed. Thomas lingered by the stone, his fingertips tracing the cold, carved letters. He murmured to himself, "At least, now they know. And you're no longer buried in silence." That evening, Rebecca Palsha aired a 10-minute feature on Alaska's news channel. Over somber music, footage of the chain sinking back into the sea was intercut with old photographs. She closed with the words, "Attu has slept quietly for 80 years. And now, with its secrets finally revealed, perhaps the souls here can truly rest." That night, Thomas returned to his small room in Anchorage. He sat by the window, staring at the city lights glittering in the darkness. But in his heart, the frozen shores of Attu were still there, with that heavy chain and the unseen eyes that no longer stopped watching him. A week after the memorial service, the shores of Attu returned to their usual desolate state. The barricades, floodlights, and field tents had all been removed, leaving only deep tire tracks on the gravel and the faint scent of chemicals carried on the cold wind. The military had withdrawn quietly, leaving behind a single metal sign driven deep into the ground. "Restricted area, under surveillance." Thomas returned to Attu alone. He walked slowly along the familiar shoreline, his boots sinking into the damp gravel. The waves lapped gently as if nothing had ever happened, and the old chain was now completely swallowed by the sea. He stood there for a long time, listening to the wind whistle through the rotting wooden stakes, like broken fingers of the past reaching upward. That night he lit a small fire on the beach. The flames danced against the black ocean, casting light on his weathered, resolute face. He murmured, as if making a promise to himself, "I've done my part. The rest belongs to history." In Anchorage, Rebecca Palsha continued her investigative series, reporting on what still hadn't been made public. She interviewed a former Pentagon staffer who admitted that the chemical stockpile recovered from Attu had been moved to a top-secret facility in Nevada, sealed away and inaccessible. When Rebecca asked if it might ever be used again, the man only gave a tired smile and said, "Secrets like that, they never really disappear. They just change hands." Rumors began to spread. Independent bloggers raised questions about whether the government had told the whole truth about what lay beneath Attu's waters. On social media, thousands debated fiercely. Some demanded full disclosure of the documents, while others argued it was better to let the ghosts rest. Eric, in his final interview before returning to California, said something that many would remember for a long time. "We think wars end when the shooting stops. But they don't. Wars just go quiet and wait for time to dig them back up. Attu is just one of thousands of pieces we've yet to face." Back on Attu's shore, Thomas stood under the silvery gray night sky, staring out over the ocean. He thought he heard the faint clinking of chains beneath the waves, the whispers of hundreds of souls mingling with the wind. He closed his eyes, murmured a quiet prayer, and finally turned to walk away. Behind him, the sea of Attu lay still once more. The waves rolled into shore, carrying with them white foam and questions that would never be answered.